Good morning. It's Monday, the 4th of December here in London. This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Iranian-backed Houthi rebels attack commercial ships in the Red Sea as Israel ramps up its offensive in Gaza.
Bill Gates warns that the world probably won't meet its climate goals as Bloomberg finds banks' green reporting lacks consistency.
Plus £8,300 worse off. Britain's economic stagnation leaves households counting the cost, according to one new report.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
A US Navy ship has responded to a flurry of drone and missile attacks against commercial ships operating in the Red Sea. The destroyer USS Carney blamed Yemen's Houthi rebels for what it said were 4 attacks against 3 separate commercial vessels. Those included an attack on the UK-owned cargo ship, the Unity Explorer, which caused minor damage. Retired US Marine Colonel Steve Ganyard says the Pentagon fears escalation.
The U.S. is being very careful not to turn the Red Sea into a shooting gallery. The Houthis continue to target what they say are only Israeli ships, but the U.S. needs to be assured, and the world needs to be assured, that there's freedom of navigation and that ships could transit the heavily trafficked Red Sea.
Steve Ganyard reflecting on the growing fears for the safety of vessels in the busy shipping lane. Last month, rebels in Yemen issued a threat against ships with ties to Israel in the area, calling them legitimate targets.
The regional escalation comes as Israel's military expands its operation against Hamas, days after a week-long truce came to an abrupt end. The Israeli military is now warning many of the territory's 2.2 million residents to evacuate parts of southern Gaza as it ramps up airstrikes on the territory. Hiba Tibi is from the aid organisation Care International.
The winter is already in Gaza. People left without proper clothing. Most of them, they already sleep outdoor in the overcrowded shelters. And now with this new evacuation, many of them say, we know we need to evacuate, but we don't know where to go with a new order.
That warning from one aid agency comes as John Kirby, spokesman for the US National Security Council, said Israel has taken steps to minimise civilian casualties.
We've urged them to, as they go south, we've said publicly, we don't want to see them move into the south unless or until they have accounted for that additional now civilian population, because they move folks out of the north into the south, hundreds of thousands of them. We want to make sure that they're properly accounted for. And again, them publishing this map online and dropping leaflets and informing people of where not to go, I mean, that is a step in the right direction.
John Kirby speaking. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says that more than 15,500 people have been killed since the conflict began 8 weeks ago. Israel says that around 400 of its soldiers and 59 police personnel have been killed since the deadly October 7th attack.
Bill Gates sees a hotter world failing to stop temperatures rising even higher. Once the world's richest man, Gates has devoted large sums of money to fighting climate change. At this year's COP summit, he told Bloomberg humanity will miss global warming targets set last decade.
No, we won't hit the aspirational targets. Well, you can do the math on 1.5, and even 2.0 isn't that likely.
Gates is still optimistic the world can avoid becoming a 3 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial era. But scientists point to this year's extreme weather as an omen of the damage climate change is causing.
Bitcoin is worth more than $40,000 for the first time in 19 months, thanks to expectations of interest rate reductions and greater demand from exchange-traded funds. Anticipation in the crypto industry is building as investors await the outcome of applications to start the first US spot ETF. Lucy Gazmararian, who is managing partner and founder of Token Bay Capital, describes how this momentum will carry over to the next year.
We see in crypto markets these sort of 4-year bull-bust cycles. So we're now sort of coming into the next bull market. And typically that gets led by Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is the leader. It's the largest crypto by market cap. It's the most liquid. And that sort of draws in the liquidity and the price pumping, if you like, as we head into the next bull cycle.
Meanwhile, the industry is also benefiting from the view that the Federal Reserve rate hiking cycle may be over as inflation cools.
UK households are now roughly £8,000 poorer than those in France and Germany, according to a major new report. The two think tanks behind it say Britain is in 15 years of stagnation and called the government's economic plan, quote, not serious. James Woolcock has the story.
The Resolution Foundation and the Centre for Economic Performance say the UK might have had its own lost decade of growth. The two top think tanks say Britons earn less and are now less productive than rival countries. But despite their major new report calling for more investment and funding for public services, taxes are at a post-war high. Labour leader Keir Starmer praised Margaret Thatcher over the weekend and says his party won't turn on spending taps if elected. In London, James Woolcock, Bloomberg Radio.
And now China Evergrande has won a reprieve in a restructuring agreement with creditors. Bloomberg's Brian Curtis has more from Hong Kong.
This buys some time for Evergrande and its creditors to do a deal. A Hong Kong court adjourned a winding up proceeding until January 29th. The unexpected delay came as the original petitioner did not push for an immediate liquidation. Bloomberg has reported that offshore creditors want a controlling interest in Evergrande and its two Hong Kong units. The builder has offered them a minority stake. Expect a lot of back and forth now over the next 8 weeks. In Hong Kong, Brian Curtis, Bloomberg Radio.
Those are your top stories on the markets. The MSCI Asia Pacific Index is 1/10% higher this morning. Eurostoxx 50 futures are also 1/10 higher. And the 10-year Treasury yield up 5 basis points today at 4.25%.
Now, in a moment, we'll be discussing fears of greenwashing in sustainable investment goals for banks. But first, another story that caught our eye. Well, actually, it's also something that might be green or might be black. It's Godzilla. It's back because, according to our reporter, Geroid Reedy, it's all around nuclear angst. This is the long-running movie franchise, and Geroid has chosen to talk about this because of its links to nuclear power and the sorts of fears that there are in the world. Yeah,
I mean, it's an interesting reflection, I suppose, on how culture reflects real life and perhaps some of those fears. He uses the idea of Godzilla's latest instalment as a sort of point of comparison as to where also the Japanese public opinion is on nuclear power compared to the last one that was released just after the Fukushima nuclear disaster as well, and how perhaps attitudes have changed. And I suppose it does provide that point of entry, as Grode discusses in this piece, as to how to think about, I suppose, how culture is reflecting perhaps some of the big fears in the world, because it's about, you know, Japan post a war.
Yes, absolutely. And this is Godzilla -1. The movie it's already landed in the US. It's coming to Europe, I think, the next few days. Yeah, I just think it's fascinating overall that, you know, that pop culture is now being analysed in such a serious way. I mean, I was joking to you earlier. I think the Barbie movie might be the most serious sort of work of the year.
And yes, and how appropriate it was too. All right. Well, that's one story that we're watching for you this morning. Let's go back to the Middle East now for the latest on the situation there. Israel's military expanding operations across Gaza, while a US Navy ship has responded to drone and missile attacks against commercial vessels in the Red Sea. Let's get the latest from Bloomberg senior reporter Anthony Squazine in Tel Aviv. Anthony, great to have you with us. The Israeli military offensive pushing into the south of Gaza. What more can you tell us this morning?
Yes, well, there was a lot of activity yesterday. I think the Israeli Defense Forces said they've struck more than 400 targets since the truce ended on Friday. We're not seeing a ground invasion yet, but definitely seeing very heavy airstrikes and targeting of Hamas targets. And obviously, this is in a very crowded area. Now, there's a lot of concern because I think there's about 1.8 million people in that little corner of Gaza. Israel has set up safe zones, has said that it's alerting people to where it's going to bomb, and has an online map as to where people can go. But nevertheless, it's coming under a lot of criticism, given that we've already seen 15,500 people killed, according to local authorities in Gaza. And it's a very difficult situation for everybody.
What is the US response to this? I mean, we've had warnings from the US Vice President Kamala Harris about Israel and civilian casualties in Gaza. How significant are the comments like that coming from the US, from a number of officials in the administration?
I think the US has definitely been stepping up its criticism of Israel's tactics and how many people have died in those attacks in terms of civilians. It's obviously very concerned. There's a lot of criticism from within the US and internationally, and it's definitely taken a tougher stance. But they still appear to back Israel's war effort and aims, which is, as we know, getting the hostages back and eliminating Hamas. And Israel's government spokesman yesterday said that the US and Israel see eye to eye on the aims of the conflict.
Anthony, we've also had these exchange of fire in the Red Sea as well. The US Navy ship had to intervene after Houthi rebels from Yemen were blamed for attacks on commercial ships. How much of an escalation are we seeing in the Red Sea?
Well, it does seem to be the most serious attacks yet. There have been a couple of instances in the last week or two of ships being targeted by those rebels, but yesterday there was a lot of activity. And the fact that we saw the naval ship have to shoot down, I think, missiles or drones, it's quite a big escalation. And obviously it's very concerning for international trade and the international shipping industry because that's a very important stretch of water.
Does it show, though, that the conflict is widening in the Middle East?
I think to a certain extent, but it's fairly limited. We haven't seen, any wider deployment of troops from anywhere else. And there is a little bit of activity on the northern border of Israel, with Hezbollah firing over anti-tank missiles and targeting, I think yesterday one of the Israeli military vehicles was targeted and there were some injuries, although quite mild. So definitely it's a concern, but I would say it's simmering rather than spreading into a wider conflagration just yet.
Okay. Anthony Squeezine in Tel Aviv this morning. Thank you very much for joining us with the latest on the situation in the Middle East.
Now, as the world's biggest banks head to Dubai for Finance Day at the COP28 climate talks, industry insiders are raising questions about their sustainable finance achievements amidst worries that they may be overstating their impact. Joining us this morning is our markets reporter, Greg Ritchie, who's been writing about this. Very good to see you, Greg. What is it that banks are doing that is facing such scrutiny?
Thanks so much for having me. So the background to this is that for years, banks have set sustainable finance targets. So typically that means they'll say they want to raise, let's say, $1 trillion of sustainable finance by 2030. And they might publicize that by saying we've reached $100 billion this year. The issue is that defining sustainable finance is very difficult and banks take very different approaches, to the extent that when you try to compare two different banks' achievements, they're almost completely impossible to compare because they include different things. So it goes beyond the intuitive things that one might expect, things like, Lone Star Wind Farm, for example, and into areas which are a lot less intuitive and some might say dubious.
So can you give us some examples then of how banks have taken different definitions of sustainable finance?
Sure. So, if you look in the UK, some of the biggest banks, Barclays, HSBC, they don't include things like M&A. So when they advise a company on a merger and acquisition, and they kind of view that acquisition as potentially being environmentally sustainable. But then if you go on the other side of the Atlantic, the major US banks, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, they do include M&A in their tallies. And immediately you can see, because of the size of M&A deals, that can quickly skew the figures and make them incomparable. There are other more niche financial products that, again, are kind of unintuitive to the average person as why there might be sustainable finance. Things like ESG derivatives and sustainability-linked loans that aren't the kind of traditional definition and are maybe pushing the boundaries a little bit.
Yeah, so where does all of this leave investors and consumers who obviously want to know how much a bank is contributing to the climate transition? Does this put the whole idea of ESG at peril?
I think it puts them in a very difficult position. I'm speaking to ESG researchers who are focusing on this, and they find it very difficult to go through all these documents and really assess how much impact a bank is having. So you can imagine a consumer, it's very difficult. Often their methodologies are buried at the bottom of documents, and even then they're often very opaque. I think it's something that is attracting a lot more scrutiny, and banks are going to have to be a lot more transparent about it going forward.
What have regulators said about this?
At the moment, the part of the issue is that regulators haven't set their own definition of sustainable finance, and in fairness to banks, they're having to navigate around that. They don't have a definition, therefore they have to make their own decisions. What we're seeing from regulators is that because these claims are so publicized, because they're often part of a bank's marketing, they'll say to consumers and to investors, we're doing so much sustainable finance a year, that it's starting to attract more regulatory scrutiny. In the UK, the Financial Conduct Authority, they sent a letter to banks' heads of ESG earlier this year about loans, and they did mention this idea of different banks taking different approaches to sustainable finance targets. So it's beginning to creep up the regulatory agenda.
So then what are the banks doing to avoid accusations of greenwashing when it comes to their businesses?
So the bankers that we've spoken to are very worried about this. They're trying to take a very cautious approach now. So maybe a few years ago, they might have labelled anything sustainable. This time they're kind of wary of the fact that if they label a product sustainable now, maybe in a year's time, will a regulator start looking at it? Will other stakeholders start looking at it? They're becoming more cautious. I think they're very wary that this is going to be something which is going to negatively impact their publicity, negatively impact their reputation, and potentially attract the scorn of regulators.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.